December 24, 1857, Christmas Eve in Savannah, Georgia. A night when church bells would ring across cobblestone streets, when wealthy families gathered around tables heavy with silver and crystal, when children dreamed of morning gifts wrapped in silk ribbons. But in the grand halls of Magnolia Heights Plantation, 20 miles south of the city, the only sound that would echo through the night would be the whisper of steel cutting through bone and the final gasps of men who believed themselves untouchable. This is the story of Rosa, a woman whose name the history books tried to bury, whose voice the courts tried to silence, whose justice they called madness. But tonight, on this sacred eve when Christians celebrate the birth of a savior, Rosa would become something else entirely. Not a victim, not a servant, not property. She would become vengeance with calloused hands and a heart too wounded to forgive. Before we descend into the darkness of that December night, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to witness stories that refuse to stay buried. The year 1857 marked the height of what Southern gentlemen called their peculiar institution. Slavery had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of Georgia that challenging it seemed as impossible as stopping the tide. In Savannah's grand mansions, enslaved hands served crystal glasses filled with French wine, while their own children went hungry in quarters built of rotting wood and broken promises. The cotton fields stretched like green oceans under the Georgian sun, each plant watered with sweat and tears, each bowl picked by fingers that would never count the coins their labor earned. Magnolia Heights stood as one of the crown jewels of Chatham County, a testament to what wealth could build on the backs of human suffering. The main house rose 3 stories high, its white columns gleaming like bleached bones in the morning sun. Sprawling verandas wrapped around each level, offering views of manicured gardens where roses bloomed red as blood and jasmine perfumed the air with sweetness that could never mask the stench of cruelty beneath. The plantation encompassed nearly 800 acres of prime Georgia soil. Cotton fields rolled like waves to the east, while rice paddies sparkled in the lowlands near the Savannah River. Ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss created cathedral-like groves where slaves once gathered in secret to sing songs of freedom in languages their captors couldn't understand. But by 1857, even those small rebellions had been crushed under the iron fist of the Whitmore family rule. 4 brothers owned this empire of suffering, 4 men who had inherited not just land and slaves, but a legacy of calculated cruelty that stretched back 3 generations. Their grandfather, Colonel Josiah Whitmore, had built the original plantation with Cherokee land stolen through broken treaties and African lives bought with blood money. Their father, Master Harrison Whitmore, had expanded the operation, adding rice cultivation and a lumber mill powered by the Savannah River's current and human desperation. Now in this winter of 1857, the 4 Whitmore brothers ruled their domain like feudal lords, each one a different shade of evil, each one convinced that God himself had ordained their supremacy. They lived in the main house like princes, dining on delicacies prepared by enslaved cooks, sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets changed by enslaved hands, conducting business deals over cigars rolled by enslaved fingers while the profits flowed into their pockets like water into a bottomless well. Marcus Whitmore, the eldest at 43, fancied himself a philosopher of bondage. He quoted Aristotle and Plato to justify owning human beings, wrote essays for the Savannah Morning News defending slavery as a civilizing force, and gave lectures at the local Presbyterian church about the divine order that placed white men at the apex of creation. But his intellectual pretensions couldn't disguise the pleasure he took in watching flesh tear under the lash, the way his eyes lit up when screams echoed across the fields. Benjamin Whitmore, 39, served as the plantation's overseer of discipline. Where Marcus cloaked his cruelty in philosophy, Benjamin embraced it naked and unashamed. He carried a bullwhip coiled at his belt like a snake, its leather handle worn smooth by his palm, its braided length stained dark with dried blood. He believed that pain was the only language slaves could understand, and he spoke it fluently. His favorite punishment was the dancing lesson, where he would force exhausted field hands to dance barefoot on broken glass while he provided rhythm with his whip. Theodore Whitmore, 35, managed the business affairs, but his ledgers recorded more than cotton bales and rice barrels. He kept detailed accounts of human flesh, noting which female slaves showed signs of fertility, which children displayed useful skills, which men possessed strength that could be literally worked to death and replaced. He treated human beings like livestock, calculating their worth in pounds and dollars, their value measured only by their capacity to generate profit before they broke. The youngest brother, Samuel Whitmore, carried the title of plantation chaplain. At 28, he conducted Sunday services for the slaves, preaching sermons about obedience and contentment, while eternal damnation awaited those who challenged the natural order. He wore his piety like armor, quoting scripture to justify every cruelty, finding biblical precedent for every atrocity. His favorite verse came from Ephesians, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling." He would recite it while watching punishments, his voice rising with religious fervor as the whip fell. Into this world of sanctified suffering, Rosa had been born 27 years earlier. Her mother, Azalea, had been a house slave renowned for her skill with needle and thread, her fingers capable of creating intricate lacework that adorned the gowns of Savannah's finest ladies. Rosa inherited her mother's delicate touch, but where Azalea had found solace in her craft, Rosa discovered something else in the precision of her stitches: patience, control, the ability to make something beautiful from raw materials, to create order from chaos. As a child, Rosa had been trained for house service, taught to move like a shadow through rooms where white folks conducted their business, to become invisible when her labor wasn't needed, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. She learned to read by studying scraps of newspapers used to wrap purchases, developed her letters by copying shopping lists left carelessly about. By the age of 15, she could write better than most poor whites in the county, though she kept this knowledge hidden like a blade concealed in silk. The house slaves occupied a strange position in the plantation hierarchy. They lived closer to their masters than field hands, wore better clothes, ate food prepared in the same kitchen that fed the white family. But this proximity came with its own particular torments. House slaves witnessed the casual cruelty of their owners' daily lives, heard conversations about buying and selling human beings, discussed over breakfast, watched children torn from their mothers' arms as easily as pulling flowers from a garden. Rosa had served in the main house for 12 years. By Christmas Eve 1857. She had learned to navigate the moods and preferences of all four brothers, had perfected the art of being present but unnoticed, essential but ignored. She knew which floorboards creaked in the early morning hours, which rooms the brothers preferred for their private meetings, where they kept their money, their weapons, their secrets. She had memorized the rhythm of the house like a musician, learning a complex symphony, every movement choreographed to perfection. But knowledge, Rosa had discovered, was a double-edged gift. The more she understood about the Whitmore brothers, the more she comprehended the true depth of their evil. She had watched Benjamin rape girls barely past childhood, had seen Marcus order families separated for the crime of loving each other too openly, had witnessed Theodore calculate the exact amount of food necessary to keep workers alive without wasting a single cent on their comfort. She had listened to Samuel's sermons about Christian mercy while he planned punishments that would make hardened soldiers weep. The slave quarters stretched behind the main house like a small village of suffering. Rows of wooden cabins, each housing multiple families, lined dirt paths that turned to mud with every rain. The buildings had been constructed with the absolute minimum materials necessary to provide shelter, their walls thin enough that conversations in one cabin could be heard in the next, their roofs designed to keep out most of the rain, but not all of it. Privacy was a luxury that slaves couldn't afford, intimacy a gift that had to be stolen in moments between exhaustion and dawn. In these quarters lived nearly 200 souls, each one a universe of dreams deferred, hopes crushed, spirits bent, but somehow not yet broken. There were children born into bondage who had never known a day of freedom, elders who remembered Africa but spoke of it only in whispers, mothers who sang lullabies in languages they were forbidden to teach their babies. There were craftsmen whose skills could have earned them fortunes in a just world, artists whose talents were channeled into making their masters' lives more beautiful, healers who used forbidden knowledge to ease suffering that the law refused to acknowledge. Among these people, Rosa moved like a bridge between two worlds. Her position in the main house gave her access to information that never reached the quarters, knowledge of plans and decisions that affected everyone's fate. She became a keeper of secrets, a witness to conversations that slave owners assumed she was too ignorant to understand. But Rosa understood everything. She remembered every casual remark about upcoming sales, every discussion of punishment, every detail of the brothers' personal lives that revealed their weaknesses and fears. The Christmas season of 1857 had begun with unusual tension. President James Buchanan's administration was struggling with the growing conflict over slavery's expansion. The Dred Scott decision had inflamed passions on both sides, and even in the Deep South, whispers of abolition grew louder each day. The Whitmore brothers felt the pressure, their conversations filled with angry denunciations of Northern interference and dire predictions about the future of their way of life. Marcus had returned from a planters' meeting in Savannah with disturbing news. Underground railroad activity was increasing along the coast, with several successful escapes reported in recent months. Federal marshals were asking questions about slave treatment, and Northern newspapers were printing accounts of Southern cruelty that made planters uncomfortable. The brothers responded by tightening discipline, increasing surveillance, and making examples of anyone who showed the slightest sign of disobedience. It was during this atmosphere of heightened suspicion that Rosa first laid eyes on Isaiah. He arrived at Magnolia Heights in late November, purchased from a failed plantation in South Carolina. Unlike most slaves who were sold for economic reasons, Isaiah carried the mark of rebellion in his bearing. He walked upright when custom demanded he shuffle, met white men's gazes when protocol required downcast eyes, and spoke in complete sentences when monosyllables were expected. Isaiah was 26 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that showed the calluses of hard labor, but eyes that burned with intelligence and unbroken pride. He had been born free in Charleston, to parents who had purchased their own liberty, had learned to read and write, had even attended a school for free blacks before South Carolina's laws changed, and his freedom became a liability. When his parents died in a yellow fever epidemic, creditors seized their property, and Isaiah found himself sold into slavery at the age of 23. The moment Rosa saw him, something long dormant stirred in her chest. Not just attraction, though Isaiah was undeniably handsome, but recognition. Here was someone who remembered what freedom felt like, who carried dignity like an invisible crown, who hadn't learned to make himself small in the presence of white power. When he looked at her, Rosa felt seen in a way that transcended the careful invisibility she had cultivated for years. Their courtship began in silence, conducted through glances across the plantation yard, brief touches when their paths crossed, words exchanged during the precious few moments when neither was under direct supervision. Isaiah had been assigned to work in the rice fields, backbreaking labor that began before dawn and ended after dark, but he found ways to appear near the main house during Rosa's few free moments. They developed a language of gestures, a vocabulary of shared looks that spoke volumes without risking the punishment that came to slaves caught in unauthorized conversation. By December, their relationship had deepened into something that transcended the brutal circumstances that surrounded them. Isaiah spoke to Rosa of the world beyond Magnolia Heights, of cities where black people walked freely, of schools where children learned to read without fear, of churches where congregations chose their own ministers instead of listening to white men preach submission. He painted visions of a future where their love wouldn't be considered property, where their children would belong to themselves instead of to masters who could sell them on a whim. Rosa had never dared to dream such dreams, but Isaiah's words awakened something in her that she had suppressed for years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of daily survival, but the dangerous hope of actual freedom. She began to imagine herself in those distant cities, walking down streets where no one owned her labor, sleeping in a bed that belonged to her, wearing clothes chosen for beauty rather than assigned for servitude. But dreams, Rosa was about to learn, were dangerous luxuries for people in bondage. The Whitmore brothers had survived and prospered by crushing hope before it could take root, by destroying love before it could threaten their control, by eliminating anything that reminded their human property that they were in fact human. And on the morning of December 22nd, 1857, they would demonstrate once again why slaves who dared to love paid the ultimate price. The day dawned gray and cold, with the kind of dampness that seeped into bones and stayed there. Rosa was in the main house kitchen before sunrise, helping to prepare breakfast for the brothers, when she heard Marcus's voice drifting in from the dining room. He was discussing the sale of several slaves to settle a gambling debt, reading names from a list with the same emotion he might use to inventory livestock. When Isaiah's name was mentioned, Rosa's hands went still on the bread dough she was kneading. The rolling pins slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the suddenly quiet kitchen. Through the doorway, she could see Marcus consulting a ledger, Theodore making calculations with his pen, Benjamin nodding approval at what must be a profitable transaction. "That new buck from Charleston will fetch a good price," Benjamin was saying. "Strong back, good teeth, young enough to give 20 years of hard labor. The rice plantation down in Beaufort County needs field hands, and they pay top dollar for prime stock." Rosa felt the world tilt around her, her vision blurring as the full implications crashed over her like a wave. Isaiah would be sold, shipped away to a place she might never see, condemned to labor that would likely kill him within those 20 years Benjamin so casually calculated. Their dreams of freedom, their whispered plans, their careful courtship, all of it would be severed as cleanly as a blade cutting thread. "When do they come for him?" Theodore asked, his pen still scratching numbers onto paper. "Day after Christmas," Marcus replied. "Let the boy enjoy the holiday, then ship him out. No sense disrupting the celebration with unnecessary dramatics." The words hit Rosa like physical blows. Day after Christmas. In 3 days, Isaiah would be gone forever, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She was property, voiceless and powerless, unable to protest or plead or bargain. The law didn't recognize her feelings. Society didn't acknowledge her humanity, and the men who owned her life saw her love as nothing more than an inconvenient attachment to be severed at their convenience. She finished her kitchen duties in a daze, her movements automatic, while her mind reeled with desperate calculations. Could they run? The Underground Railroad had routes through Georgia, but reaching them would require crossing miles of hostile territory with bloodhounds and bounty hunters in pursuit. Could she plead with the brothers? They would laugh at her presumption, perhaps punish her for daring to value her own desires above their financial decisions. Could she find money to buy Isaiah's freedom? She possessed nothing, owned nothing, had no way to earn the hundreds of dollars such a purchase would require. That night, Rosa slipped away from the main house and made her way to the rice fields, where Isaiah labored under the light of torches. She found him working late, as field hands often did, when the harvest demanded every daylight hour and more. When she appeared at the edge of the paddies like a ghost in her dark dress, he looked up with surprise and joy that quickly faded when he saw her expression. "They're selling you," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like pieces of her soul. "Day after Christmas, to Beaufort County." Isaiah's face went still, but Rosa saw his hands tighten on the rice stalks he was cutting. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of inevitability settling around them like fog. Finally, he straightened and looked at her with eyes that held all the pain and rage and helpless love in the world. "Then we run," he said simply. "Tomorrow night, while they're celebrating Christmas Eve, we head for the river, find a boat, make for the coast. I'd rather die free than live as property." Rosa stared at him, her heart breaking with the impossibility of it all. She knew the stories of runaways, knew how few made it to true freedom, knew what happened to those who were caught. But looking into Isaiah's face, seeing the determination there, she also knew that she would follow him anywhere, even to death. "Tomorrow night," she agreed, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "After midnight, when the house is quiet, I'll meet you by the old oak near the river road." They held each other then, there in the dark rice field with mud sucking at their feet and the smell of stagnant water in their nostrils. It was a kiss that tasted of desperation and dreams, of love too powerful to be contained by law or custom, or the cruelty of men who bought and sold human hearts. It was a kiss that would have to last them through eternity, because tomorrow night would either set them free or destroy them both. As Rosa made her way back to the slave quarters, she felt something hardening inside her chest. Not just resolve, but something colder and more dangerous. If tomorrow night's escape failed, if they were caught and punished and separated forever, she would not go quietly into that darkness. She would not accept her fate with the meek submission that Samuel preached in his Sunday sermons. The Whitmore brothers believed they owned her, but they were about to discover that some things cannot be owned, cannot be bought, cannot be sold. Love could be constrained, but not conquered. Hope could be delayed, but not destroyed. And justice, even when delayed by years of suffering, would eventually demand payment in full. Rosa lay awake that night in her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the quarters around her. Children coughing in the cold, mothers humming lullabies to ease their babies' hunger, old men muttering prayers in languages from across the ocean. These were her people, her family, her community of survival. Tomorrow night, she would leave them behind forever or die in the attempt. But as she drifted towards sleep, Rosa's thoughts were not of escape routes or freedom songs or the Underground Railroad. Instead, she found herself thinking about the main house, about the kitchen where she had worked for 12 years, about the knives that hung on hooks by the hearth, sharp and clean and waiting. She thought about the brothers sleeping soundly in their beds, secure in their power, confident in their safety, and for the first time in her life, Rosa smiled in the darkness, not with joy, but with something far more dangerous. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, a night when Christians celebrated the birth of their Savior. But if tomorrow night's escape failed, Rosa was beginning to realize Christmas Eve might become something else entirely, a night of judgment. A night when the powerless became powerful, when the owned reclaimed their humanity, when love struck back at those who tried to destroy it. The axe she used for splitting kindling behind the kitchen was sharp and heavy in her hands. She had used it hundreds of times to prepare wood for the fires that warmed the main house, to create comfort for the very men who denied her basic humanity. But an axe was a tool that could serve many purposes, and Rosa was beginning to understand that some purposes were more important than others. Tomorrow night would bring either freedom or death. But looking up at the stars through her small window, Rosa felt a strange peace settling over her. Whatever happened, she would face it on her own terms. The scared girl who had learned to be invisible was gone, replaced by a woman who remembered what it meant to be human. Christmas Eve 1857 was coming, and with it, a reckoning that the Whitmore brothers would never see coming. December 23rd dawned with the kind of crystalline cold that made breath visible and turned the ground hard as stone. Rosa moved through her morning duties in the main house with mechanical precision, her hands steady as she prepared breakfast, her face composed as she served the Whitmore brothers their eggs and bacon and fresh-baked biscuits. But beneath the surface calm, her mind raced with plans and contingencies, calculating distances and timing and the 100 variables that would determine whether she and Isaiah lived or died come tomorrow's dawn. The brothers were in high spirits, anticipating their Christmas Eve celebration with the enthusiasm of men who had never known true suffering. Marcus held court at the head of the table, regaling his siblings with quotes from classical literature about the divine right of masters over servants. Benjamin cleaned his fingernails with a knife while describing the new punishment techniques he planned to introduce in the coming year. Theodore consulted his ledgers even during breakfast, muttering calculations about cotton prices and rice yields. Samuel read passages from Scripture, his voice rising with righteous fervor as he praised God for blessing them with dominion over inferior races. Rosa listened to their words with new ears, hearing not the casual cruelty she had grown accustomed to, but the voices of men so certain of their superiority that they couldn't imagine it being challenged. They spoke of slaves as livestock, planned punishments like entertainment, discussed human suffering with less emotion than they devoted to the weather. These were not men, Rosa realized, but monsters wearing the masks of civilization, predators who used law and religion to justify their appetites for power and pain. Marcus Whitmore had been born into wealth and raised to believe that his comfort required other people's misery. At 43, he possessed the soft flesh of a man who had never known physical labor, hands that had never been calloused by honest work, a back that had never bent under the weight of another man's burden. His education at the College of Charleston had filled his head with philosophy and poetry, but his heart remained empty of empathy or compassion. He read Aristotle's justifications of slavery with the same pleasure other men found in adventure novels, quoted Plato's hierarchy of souls to explain why some people were born to rule and others to serve. But Marcus's intellectual pretensions couldn't disguise his true nature. Rosa had seen him watching whippings with bright, eager eyes, had heard the excitement in his voice when he described new punishments, had witnessed the way he lingered over detailed accounts of slave rebellions and their brutal suppression. His cruelty was refined, clothed in scholarly language and biblical precedent, but it was cruelty nonetheless. He ordered families separated with the same dispassion he might use to discuss crop rotation, sentenced human beings to lives of suffering with quotes from ancient philosophers, and slept soundly every night secure in his belief that God himself approved of his actions. Benjamin Whitmore made no pretense of civilized restraint. At 39, he stood 6 feet tall with the lean, muscular build of a man who enjoyed physical violence, who found pleasure in breaking things that couldn't fight back. His hands bore the scars of his trade, rope burns from pulling hanging nooses tight, calluses from gripping whip handles, bite marks from slaves who had tried desperately to defend themselves. He wore these marks like decorations, proof of his dedication to maintaining order through terror. Rosa had watched Benjamin work, had seen him apply pain with the precision of an artist. He understood exactly how much suffering a human body could endure without dying, how to inflict maximum agony while preserving the victim's ability to continue laboring. His favorite punishment was something he called the wedding dance, where he would strip slaves naked and force them to dance on broken glass while he played wedding march music on his fiddle. The irony delighted him. making people dance to celebrate union while their feet bled from separation, forcing joy from bodies racked with pain. The overseer's cabin, where Benjamin lived alone, was filled with implements of torture that he had crafted himself. Whips of different lengths and weights for different purposes, brands heated in his fireplace to mark runaways, shackles designed to cause maximum discomfort during long confinements. He had studied anatomy to better understand how to cause pain without permanent damage, had experimented with different techniques on slaves too old or sick to be valuable as laborers. His notebooks contained detailed descriptions of his methods, careful observations about which approaches produced the desired psychological effects. Theodore Whitmore approached cruelty from a different angle, seeing human suffering as a mathematical problem to be optimized. At 35, he possessed the thin, pale appearance of a man who spent his days hunched over ledgers, calculating the precise intersection of maximum profit and minimum investment. His mind worked like an accounting machine, reducing human lives to numbers, human relationships to economic transactions, human pain to necessary business expenses. In Theodore's ledgers, slaves were listed alongside livestock and equipment, their monetary value carefully tracked, their depreciation calculated, their replacement costs planned for in advance. He had developed formulas for determining the optimal amount of food required to maintain productivity without wasting resources on comfort, the ideal number of working hours that would maximize output without causing total breakdown, the most cost-effective punishments that would maintain discipline without destroying valuable property. Rosa had seen Theodore's private records, had glimpsed the columns where he tracked slave pregnancies like breeding livestock, noted which children showed promise for house service versus field labor, calculated the financial impact of family separations versus keeping related slaves together. He approached human bondage with the cold logic of a scientist, testing hypotheses about control and resistance, documenting results with clinical detachment, adjusting variables to improve outcomes. Samuel Whitmore represented perhaps the most insidious form of evil, cruelty wrapped in religious righteousness, brutality justified by biblical interpretation, sadism sanctified by claims of divine mandate. At 28, he was the youngest brother, but possibly the most dangerous, because he genuinely believed that God had ordained slavery, that black people were cursed descendants of Ham, that inflicting suffering on inferior races was a sacred duty. Samuel's sermons to the slaves were masterpieces of psychological manipulation, designed to convince victims that their suffering was divinely planned, that resistance was sinful, that submission would be rewarded in the afterlife. He preached about heavenly mansions where faithful slaves would finally find peace, but only if they accepted their earthly bondage without complaint. He quoted scripture to justify every cruelty, found biblical precedent for every atrocity, turned the slaves' own faith against them with twisted theology. But Samuel's religious facade cracked when he thought no one was watching. Rosa had seen him beat children with a fury that bordered on madness, had heard him scream obscenities while administering punishments, had witnessed the unholy pleasure that filled his eyes when he broke strong spirits and proud backs. His Bible was annotated with notes about controlling rebellion, marked passages about the divine nature of hierarchy, underlined verses that could be weaponized against hope and human dignity. These four men ruled Magnolia Heights like petty gods, each contributing his own expertise to the machinery of oppression. Marcus provided the intellectual framework, Benjamin supplied the physical enforcement, Theodore managed the economic optimization, and Samuel offered the spiritual justification. Together, they had created a system of bondage so complete, so carefully designed, that it seemed impossible to challenge or escape. But Rosa had found the system's weakness, the single flaw that all their careful planning couldn't account for. They had assumed that their victims were objects, that slaves lacked the capacity for strategic thinking, that people in bondage would never risk everything for love or freedom or justice. The Whitmore brothers understood economics and theology and philosophy, but they had never learned the most dangerous knowledge of all, that human beings, no matter how oppressed, remained human beings. As Christmas Eve approached, Rosa began her final preparations. She moved through the main house like a student memorizing a lesson, noting which floorboards creaked, which doors' hinges squeaked, which rooms offered the best hiding places. She observed the brothers' routines, their habits, their preferences, cataloging information that might prove useful when darkness fell and plans turned into action. The Christmas Eve celebration was scheduled to begin at sunset, with a feast in the main dining room. The brothers had invited several neighboring planters and their families, transforming the evening into a display of wealth and power. Slaves would serve the meal, pour the wine, and provide entertainment. Invisible labor creating visible luxury for people who believed such comfort was their natural right. Rosa worked in the kitchen throughout the afternoon, helping to prepare dishes that represented months of planning and preparation. Roasted goose stuffed with cornbread and chestnuts, glazed ham carved with decorative flourishes, vegetables grown in the plantation garden, and preserved through careful timing. Each dish represented hours of enslaved labor, skills passed down through generations of people who cooked elaborate meals they would never be allowed to eat. As she worked, Rosa listened to conversations between the household slaves, gathering intelligence about the evening's schedule. The guests would arrive at 6 o'clock, dinner would be served at 7, dancing would begin at 9 with music provided by slaves trained in European instruments. The celebration would likely continue past midnight, with the brothers and their friends drinking heavily, telling stories, and boasting about their successes in the slave trade. At 4 o'clock, Rosa slipped away from the kitchen and made her way to the slave quarters. She needed to speak with Isaiah to coordinate their escape plans, to ensure that everything was ready for their midnight flight to freedom. But when she reached the rice fields where he had been working, she found only empty paddies and abandoned tools scattered in the mud. Terror gripped her heart as she searched frantically for any sign of Isaiah's whereabouts. Had he been moved to another work detail? Had someone discovered their relationship and reported it to the brothers? Had the escape plan been betrayed by someone who hoped to gain favor with their masters? Rosa's breath came in short gasps as she considered the horrible possibilities, each scenario more devastating than the last. Finally, she found one of the older field hands resting in the shade of a live oak. Moses was a man in his 60s who had survived 4 decades of bondage through careful observation and cautious wisdom. When Rosa approached him, his expression was grave, his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow that came from witnessing too many tragedies. "They took him this morning," Moses said quietly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of Spanish moss in the breeze. "Right after breakfast. Said they wasn't waiting until after Christmas. Said the buyer was coming today with cash money and a wagon." The words hit Rosa like physical blows, driving the air from her lungs and sending her stumbling backward against the tree trunk. Isaiah was gone. Their escape plan was destroyed. Their love had been severed as casually as cutting a rope, their future together erased with a bill of sale and a handful of coins. "Where?" Rosa whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Beaufort County, like they said," Moses replied. "Rice plantation down toward the coast, but child, that ain't the worst of it." His ancient eyes met hers, and Rosa saw a lifetime of accumulated pain reflected there. "Boyd tried to fight when they loaded him in the wagon, put up a struggle, called out your name. They beat him something fierce, then shackled him hand and foot. Last I seen, he was bleeding from the head and barely conscious." Rosa closed her eyes and felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Not just her heart, though that was shattered beyond repair, but something deeper and more essential. The part of her that had learned to endure, to survive, to find small pockets of peace within the machinery of oppression. Isaiah's love had awakened dreams she had never dared to dream, but now those dreams lay bleeding in the dirt of a Beaufort County rice field. "There's more," Moses continued, his voice heavy with reluctance. "They've been talking about you, about how close you and that boy got. Master Benjamin, he thinks you might try to run might cause trouble. He's got plans for you, child. Plans that don't involve you staying in the main house much longer." Rosa opened her eyes and looked at Moses with a strange calm descending over her. "What kind of plans?" "Field work," Moses said. "Hard labor in the rice paddies, dawn to dusk, no more house privileges, and other things. Benjamin's been watching you, talking about how house slaves sometimes need to be reminded of their place. He's got ideas about breaking proud spirits, about showing other slaves what happens when they get above themselves." The old man's words painted a picture that Rosa understood perfectly. She would be made an example, her punishment designed to terrorize other slaves into complete submission. Her love for Isaiah, her moment of happiness, her brief glimpse of hope, all of it would be twisted into a weapon against her own people. The brothers would use her suffering to strengthen their control, to demonstrate that even the smallest rebellion would be crushed without mercy. Rosa stood up slowly, her legs steady, despite the earthquakes shaking her soul. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Moses, her voice surprisingly calm. "I needed to know." "Child," Moses said urgently, reaching out to catch her hand, "don't do nothing foolish. I know you're hurting, No, it feels like the world's ending, but there's ways to survive even this. You can endure fieldwork, can outlast whatever Benjamin's got planned. The strong ones, the smart ones like you, they find ways to keep going. Rosa looked down at the old man's weathered hand gripping hers, seeing decades of survival written in every line and scar. Moses had endured 40 years of bondage by learning to bend without breaking, to submit without surrendering his essential self. He had watched countless tragedies, witnessed the destruction of families and dreams and hopes, and he had survived by accepting what couldn't be changed and finding strength in small victories. But as Rosa gently pulled her hand free from Moses's grip, she realized that she was not Moses. She had not spent 4 decades learning the careful balance between resistance and submission. She had tasted freedom in Isaiah's arms, had felt what it meant to be truly seen and valued and loved. Having experienced that, she could not go back to being invisible, could not return to the careful dance of survival that house slavery required. There are different ways to be strong, Rosa said quietly, and Moses saw something in her eyes that made him release her hand completely. Some folks endure by bending. Others endure by standing straight, even when it kills them. Rosa walked away from the old oak tree with her back straight and her head high, moving with the measured pace of someone who had made a fundamental decision. She returned to the main house as shadows began to lengthen, as the first guests arrived for the Christmas Eve celebration, as the kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of a feast being prepared by people who would not be invited to share it. The evening proceeded exactly as planned. Guests arrived in carriages that gleamed with fresh polish, ladies in silk gowns that rustled like autumn leaves, gentlemen in tailored coats discussing cotton prices and the growing political tension between North and South. The dining room filled with laughter and conversation, crystal glasses reflecting candlelight, silver utensils gleaming against white tablecloths. Rosa served the meal with mechanical precision, moving between kitchen and dining room like a shadow, invisible to the white folks celebrating their prosperity built on black suffering. She poured wine and cleared plates, and responded to orders with the practiced deference of a perfect house slave. But her mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning and preparing for what would come after midnight. As the evening wore on, the guests grew increasingly drunk and boisterous. Stories were told of successful slave auctions, profitable cotton harvests, and rebellions crushed with appropriate brutality. The men boasted about their property, both land and human, while their wives gossiped about neighbors and complained about the difficulty of finding properly trained house servants. The conversation swirled around Rosa like smoke, familiar and suffocating and utterly revealing of the world she lived in. By 10 o'clock, Rosa had heard enough to understand the evening's rhythm. The guests would continue drinking and socializing until well past midnight, then retire to guest rooms, prepared throughout the main house. The brothers would likely stay up even later, enjoying their role as hosts and the opportunity to display their wealth and power to their peers. This meant the house would remain active far longer than Rosa had originally calculated, complicating her plans, but not altering her fundamental decision. At 11 o'clock, she slipped away from the dining room and made her way to the kitchen. The other house slaves were busy cleaning dishes and preparing guest rooms, too occupied with their duties to notice Rosa's movements. She moved with the practiced invisibility of someone trained to be unobtrusive, her steps silent on familiar floorboards, her presence unremarkable in the busy household. Behind the kitchen, near the woodpile where she had split kindling hundreds of times, Rosa found what she was looking for. The axe hung on its accustomed hook, its blade sharp from recent grinding, its handle worn smooth by her own hands. She lifted it carefully, testing its weight, remembering all the times she had used it for innocent purposes, splitting logs for winter fires, chopping kindling for cooking stoves, preparing fuel to warm the very people who had destroyed her chance at happiness. But tonight the axe would serve a different purpose. Tonight it would become an instrument of justice rather than service, a tool of liberation rather than labor. Rosa wrapped the blade in a kitchen towel and secured it under her apron, the weight of it against her hip both comforting and terrifying. She was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, making a choice that would either free her soul or destroy her body. As she returned to the main house, Rosa felt a strange peace settling over her. The terror and desperation that had consumed her earlier in the day had been replaced by cold clarity. She understood exactly what she was about to do, exactly what the consequences would be, exactly how her story would end. But for the first time in her life, the ending would be her choice, written in her own hand, rather than dictated by masters who saw her as property. The celebration continued around her, But Rosa no longer heard the laughter or felt the weight of service. She moved through the evening's remaining tasks like a woman in a dream, preparing guest rooms, banking fires, securing the house for the night. Each action felt significant, final, like a ritual performed in preparation for something sacred and terrible. By midnight, most of the guests had retired to their rooms, though sounds of conversation and laughter still drifted from the main parlor, where the Whitmore brothers continued entertaining a few hardy souls who refused to let Christmas Eve end. Rosa climbed the servants' stair to her small room in the attic, moving quietly past sleeping household slaves, carrying her burden with careful balance. In her room, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared out the small window at the December stars. Somewhere to the south, Isaiah was chained in unfamiliar quarters, his head still bleeding from the beating he had received for calling her name, his body already being broken by labor that would likely kill him within the 20 years Benjamin had so casually calculated. The brothers slept peacefully below, secure in their power, confident that morning would bring more of the same comfortable cruelty they had always known. But Rosa knew something they didn't. Morning would bring a reckoning that none of them had anticipated. Justice delayed but not denied, payment extracted for years of accumulated suffering. The scared girl who had learned to be invisible was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood that some things were worth dying for. She reached under her mattress and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the few possessions that belonged entirely to her. A thimble her mother had given her, worn smooth by years of sewing. A pressed flower Isaiah had picked for her during one of their stolen moments together. A piece of paper, where she had practiced writing her name, the letters formed with careful precision. These things would survive her, small testimonies to a life that had contained more than servitude, to a woman who had dared to love and dream and hope. Rosa carefully rewrapped her treasures and placed them back under the mattress. Tomorrow someone else would sleep in this bed, would inherit her few possessions, would take her place in the careful hierarchy of house slavery. But tonight was still hers, and she intended to use every moment of it. She stood up and smoothed her dress, checked that the axe remained secure under her apron, listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Below, the celebration was finally winding down, voices growing softer, footsteps heading toward bedrooms, the great house preparing for sleep after a successful evening of displaying wealth built on human misery. Rosa opened her door and stepped into the hallway, moving with the practiced silence of someone trained to be unobtrusive. But tonight, her invisibility would serve a different purpose. Tonight, she would move through the shadows with deadly purpose, carrying justice in the form of cold steel. The house was finally quiet except for the distant sound of wind in the eaves and the settling creaks of old wood. Rosa made her way down the servants' stair, each step measured and deliberate, the axe a steady weight against her hip. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused to listen, identifying the sounds that would guide her movements. Snoring from the guest rooms, the tick of the grandfather clock in the main hall, the whisper of dying embers in fireplaces throughout the house. Christmas Day was only hours away, but Rosa knew that for the Whitmore brothers, Christmas would never come. The main house at Magnolia Heights had never been darker or more dangerous. Oil lamps burned low in their sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach toward Rosa as she moved through corridors she had walked for 12 years. But tonight, every familiar detail felt transformed, charged with terrible purpose. The portraits of dead Whitmores watched from their gilded frames as she passed, their painted eyes unable to prevent what was coming for their descendants. Rosa's first target lay behind the heavy oak door of the master study, where Marcus Whitmore had retreated after the last guests retired. Through the keyhole, she could see golden light spilling from his reading lamp, could hear the scratch of his pen across paper as he worked on correspondence or perhaps another of his philosophical essays justifying human bondage. The eldest brother had always been a creature of habit, predictable in his routines, confident in his security. She tested the door handle, unlocked as always. Marcus's arrogance extended to his personal safety. He had never imagined that anyone in his own house might pose a threat to his well-being. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing the sanctum where so many cruel decisions had been made, where human lives had been reduced to numbers in ledgers, where families had been torn apart with the stroke of a pen. Marcus sat behind his mahogany desk, still dressed in his evening clothes, a glass of brandy at his elbow, and a book of Greek philosophy open before him. His grey hair caught the lamplight as he bent over his writing, completely absorbed in whatever intellectual exercise occupied his thoughts. For a moment, Rosa simply watched him, This man who had owned her body and labor for years, while never truly seeing her as human. "Master Marcus," she said quietly, her voice carrying no deference for the first time in her life. He looked up with mild irritation, his pale eyes focusing on her with the same attention he might give to an interrupting servant. "Rosa, what are you doing here at this hour? The guests have retired, the kitchen work is finished. You should be in your quarters." "Yes, sir," Rosa replied, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind her. "I should be in my quarters, but I'm not. I'm here." Something in her tone must have penetrated his distraction, because Marcus set down his pen and studied her more carefully. His gaze took in her unusual stillness, the way she stood without the submissive posture he expected, the strange calm that seemed to surround her like armor. "Is something wrong?" he asked, and Rosa almost laughed at the question. Everything was wrong. Everything had always been wrong. But tonight, she was going to make something right. "Isaiah," she said simply, watching Marcus's face for recognition. "The field hand we sold today." Marcus waved dismissively. "What about him? The transaction is complete. The buyer satisfied. The boy is no longer our concern." "He was my concern," Rosa said, her voice steady as stone. "He was my heart. And you sold him like livestock." Marcus's expression shifted from mild irritation to genuine surprise. "Your heart? Rosa, surely you understand that attachments between slaves are inconvenient. We can't allow personal feelings to interfere with business decisions. The boy was valuable property, and we received an excellent price." "Property," Rosa repeated, tasting the word like poison. "Is that what you think I am? Property?" "Well, yes," Marcus said, his surprise deepening into confusion. "Of course, you're valuable property, Rosa. Well-trained, reliable, worth considerably more than most house slaves. But property nonetheless." Rosa reached under her apron and drew out the axe, its blade gleaming in the lamplight. Marcus's eyes widened as he took in the weapon, his scholar's mind finally grasping that his favorite philosophical principles were about to be tested in the most practical way possible. "Property," Rosa said again, raising the axe above her head, "doesn't feel love. Property doesn't grieve. Property doesn't seek justice." She brought the blade down with all the strength in her arms, all the rage in her heart, all the love that had been stolen from her. The axe split Marcus Whitmore's skull like an overripe melon, sending blood and brain matter spattering across his precious books, his careful correspondence, his philosophical treatises about the natural order of superior and inferior races. His body jerked once and went still, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling while his blood soaked into papers that would never again justify human bondage. Rosa stood over the corpse, breathing heavily, the axe dripping in her hands. She felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a terrible emptiness where her heart used to be. This was not victory. It was necessity. This was not revenge. It was justice delayed too long. Marcus Whitmore would write no more essays about the divine right of masters. He would make no more decisions about buying and selling human souls. His voice was silenced forever. She cleaned the axe blade on Marcus's expensive curtains, then made her way back into the hallway. 3 more doors. 3 more monsters wearing human faces. 3 more debts to be paid in blood. Benjamin Whitmore slept in the overseer's wing, a separate section of the house that he had designed for his particular needs. Rosa knew the route well. She had carried meals to his quarters, had cleaned bloodstains from his floors, had seen the implements of torture he kept polished and ready for use. The hallway leading to his room was lined with portraits of his victims, sketches he had made of slaves during and after punishments, artistic tributes to his skill at inflicting pain. His door was heavier than Marcus's, reinforced with iron bands and multiple locks. Benjamin was paranoid about security, aware that his cruelty had earned him enemies among the slave population. But Rosa had keys. House slaves always had keys. She had copied them years ago, just one of many small rebellions that had prepared her for this moment. The locks turned silently, well maintained like everything else Benjamin used for his work. Rosa slipped into the room and immediately understood why he had needed reinforced doors. The walls were covered with whips, brands, chains, and devices whose purposes she could only guess at. This was not a bedroom. It was a museum of human suffering, a shrine to systematic cruelty. Benjamin lay sprawled across his bed, snoring heavily, still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his shirt unbuttoned and his belt loosened. Even in sleep, his face bore the marks of habitual cruelty, lips curved in a permanent sneer, eyes that probably dreamed of breaking spirits and tearing flesh. Rosa approached the bed slowly, the axe ready in her hands. But as she raised the weapon, Benjamin's eyes snapped open with the alertness of a predator sensing danger. He rolled sideways, just as the axe descended, the blade embedding itself in the mattress where his head had been a moment before. He came up off the bed with surprising speed for a drunk man, his hand already reaching for the whip that hung beside his pillow. "Well, well," Benjamin snarled, his voice thick with alcohol and excitement. "Little Rosa finally shows her teeth. I've been waiting for this, girl. Been hoping you'd give me an excuse to show you what real pain feels like." The whip cracked through the air, its tip catching Rosa across the shoulder and tearing through her dress to the skin beneath. She gasped but didn't cry out, yanking the axe free from the mattress and swinging it in a wide arc that forced Benjamin to leap backward. "You killed Marcus," Benjamin said, and Rosa heard admiration mixed with the cruelty in his voice. "Didn't think you had it in you, house girl, but you made one mistake. You came for me while I was awake." The whip lashed out again, this time wrapping around the axe handle and nearly tearing it from Rosa's grip. Benjamin was an expert with his weapons, skilled at disarming opponents, experienced at turning defiance into submission. But Rosa had advantages he couldn't understand. She had nothing left to lose, no future to protect, no hope to preserve. She let him pull the axe toward him, using his own strength against him as she followed the weapon's path and drove her knee into his groin with all the force she could muster. Benjamin doubled over, his grip on the whip loosening, and Rosa reclaimed her weapon while he gasped for breath. "That's for every woman you ever touched," she hissed, bringing the axe down on his back with enough force to sever his spine. "That's for every child you terrorized." Benjamin collapsed face first onto the floor, paralyzed but still conscious, still able to feel pain. Rosa knelt beside him, her voice calm and conversational as she spoke. "You always said pain was the only language slaves could understand. Let me teach you some new words." The second blow took off his right hand. The third opened his skull. The fourth and fifth and sixth were for Isaiah, for herself, for every victim whose screams had entertained this monster. When she finally stopped, Benjamin Whitmore was no longer recognizable as human, just meat and bone scattered across the floor of his chamber of horrors. Rosa stood slowly, her body aching from the fight, her dress torn and bloody. 2 down, 2 to go. But the night was still young and she had work to finish. Theodore Whitmore had chosen the guest wing for his quarters, preferring the quiet luxury of rooms designed for visiting dignitaries rather than the working areas where his brothers lived. Rosa found him in the blue bedroom, surrounded by ledgers and account books even in sleep, his thin fingers still clutching a pen as if he might wake up and immediately resume calculating profits from human misery. Unlike his brothers, Theodore woke slowly, confusion clouding his pale eyes as he took in Rosa's presence beside his bed. Blood stained her dress, her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, and she held an axe that dripped with fresh gore. For a moment, his accountant's mind tried to process this impossible equation. A house slave in his bedroom with a weapon, covered in what could only be his brother's blood. "This is a dream," he said finally, his voice thin and reedy. "This can't be real. Slaves don't, they wouldn't." "Your books are wrong," Rosa said quietly. "You calculated everything except this. You forgot that people aren't numbers, that love can't be bought and sold, that justice doesn't appear on any ledger." Theodore's mind, trained to find solutions to complex problems, began working frantically. "Wait, whatever they did to you, whatever happened, we can fix it. I can find your Isaiah, can buy him back, can set you both free. I have money, connections, influence. Just put down the axe and let's discuss terms." "Discuss terms?" Rosa laughed, the sound bitter as winter wind. "You want to negotiate? After 12 years of owning my life, my labor, my dreams, you want to bargain? I can make you rich," Theodore said desperately, sitting up in bed and reaching for his coat where he kept his wallet. "Land, money, freedom papers, anything you want. Just name your price." "My price," Rosa said, raising the axe, "is your life. It's been the same price for 12 years, Theodore. You just never bothered to check the accounts." The axe came down with the precision of a bookkeeper balancing ledgers, splitting Theodore Whitmore's skull exactly down the middle. His blood splattered across his precious calculations, his careful records of human value reduced to nothing more than wet paper and ruined ink. Rosa watched his life drain out of him like water from a broken jar, thinking about all the families he had separated with his mathematical precision, all the children he had sold like livestock in his endless pursuit of profit. 3 down, 1 to go. But Rosa knew that Samuel would be the most dangerous, not because he was the strongest or the cruelest, but because he genuinely believed that God approved of everything he did. Religious fanatics were harder to predict, more likely to fight with the desperate fury of the righteous. She found Samuel in the chapel he had built in the east wing of the house, a small sanctuary where he conducted private prayers and prepared his sermons for the slaves. He knelt before a simple wooden cross, his lips moving in silent communion with his deity, completely absorbed in spiritual contemplation. Rosa paused in the doorway, struck by the irony of the scene. She was about to commit murder in a house of worship, about to send a man to meet the God he claimed to serve. "Samuel," she said softly, and he turned with the peaceful expression of a man whose conscience was clear. "Rosa, child, what are you doing here so late? And what?" His eyes took in her blood-stained appearance, the axe in her hands, the terrible calm that surrounded her like an aura of death. "What have you done?" "I've been delivering messages," Rosa said, stepping into the chapel and closing the door behind her. "Marcus sends his regards from hell. Benjamin wanted you to know that pain really is a universal language. Theodore's final calculation was that your religion is worthless when it comes to stopping justice." Samuel's face went white, but he didn't retreat or plead. Instead, he rose to his full height and faced her with the courage of true conviction. "You poor deluded child, can't you see that this is exactly what I've been preaching about? The savage nature of your race, the need for constant supervision, the danger of allowing inferior beings too much freedom?" "Inferior beings," Rosa said, her voice deadly quiet. "Tell me, Samuel, which one of us is standing here with blood on our hands? Which one of us has spent years torturing innocent people? Which one of us has used God's name to justify cruelty that would make devils weep?" "Everything I did was righteous," Samuel declared, his voice rising with religious fervor. "God made you to serve, made you to suffer for the sins of your ancestors. Ham looked upon his father's nakedness, and his descendants were cursed to be slaves forever. I was doing God's work." "Then go ask God if you were right," Rosa said, and swung the axe with all her remaining strength. But Samuel had been expecting the attack, and he threw himself sideways, the blade missing his head by inches and embedding itself in the wooden cross behind him. The irony was perfect. Rosa's weapon of justice, stuck in the symbol of Christian mercy, held fast by wood that had been sanctified by hypocritical prayers. Samuel grabbed a heavy brass candlestick from the altar and swung it at Rosa's head. She ducked, but the blow caught her shoulder and sent her staggering. The chapel was small, filled with furniture and religious artifacts that limited movement, turning the fight into a desperate close-quarters struggle. "I'll make an example of you," Samuel screamed, his religious composure completely gone, replaced by the raw fury of a man whose worldview was being destroyed. "I'll have you flayed alive in front of every slave on this plantation. I'll make them watch while I peel the skin from your bones." He swung the candlestick again, and Rosa caught his wrist, using her momentum to drive him backward into the altar. Religious items crashed to the floor. Communion wine, holy water, prayer books, all the symbols of a faith that had been twisted into justification for human bondage. Rosa fought with the desperation of a woman who had already died inside, who had nothing left to preserve except the memory of love and the promise of justice. Samuel fought with the fury of a fanatic whose entire belief system was under attack. They rolled across the floor of the chapel, knocking over chairs and candles, their struggle lit by the flickering flames of faith about to be extinguished forever. Finally, Rosa managed to work the axe free from the cross. Samuel saw the blade coming and raised his hands to ward off the blow, but nothing could stop what had been 12 years in the making. The axe cleaved through his upraised arms and buried itself in his chest, sending blood spraying across the chapel walls like a benediction written in crimson. Samuel Whitmore died with a prayer on his lips, but Rosa didn't think God was listening. If there was a God, if there was justice in heaven, then what she had done tonight was not murder but divine judgment delayed. 4 brothers who had built their fortune on human suffering, who had treated people like property, who had destroyed love and hope and faith, all of them now lay dead by the hand of a slave they had never bothered to see as human. Rosa sat in the ruined chapel, surrounded by the debris of false religion and the bodies of dead tyrants. The axe lay beside her, its work finally complete, its blade still warm with the blood of justice. She felt empty now, hollowed out, as if everything that had made her human had been poured out with the lives of the Whitmore brothers. But she was not finished. There was one more act to this drama, one final scene to be played out before the curtain fell forever. Rosa stood slowly, her body aching, her dress torn and stained, her hands still bloody from the night's work. She walked through the house one last time, moving from room to room, lighting every lamp and candle she could find. The main house at Magnolia Heights blazed with light as Christmas morning approached, every window glowing like a beacon in the darkness. Rosa wanted the slaves in the quarters to see, wanted them to know that something fundamental had changed in their world. The Whitmore brothers would never again order a whipping, never again separate families, never again reduce human beings to numbers in ledgers. She returned to the main dining room, where the remnants of the Christmas Eve feast still decorated the table. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, silverware gleamed against white tablecloths, and the smell of roasted meat still lingered in the air. Rosa poured herself a glass of wine, the finest French vintage saved for special occasions, and sat at the head of the table where Marcus usually held court. The wine tasted like freedom. Dawn came to Magnolia Heights like a judgment, pale and cold and unforgiving. The first light revealed a plantation transformed, its natural order shattered as completely as the skulls of the men who had ruled it. Smoke still rose from the main house chimneys, but the fires that burned within were tended by no living hand. The slaves in the quarters woke to an unusual silence, no bells summoning them to labor, no overseer's shouts cutting through the morning air, no familiar sounds of a plantation beginning its daily routine of exploitation. Rosa sat where she had spent the night, at the head of the Whitmore dining table, surrounded by the remnants of wealth built on human suffering. The wine glass in her hand was empty now, drained hours ago, but she continued to hold it like a chalice of communion. She had not slept, had not moved from her position, had simply waited for the sun to rise on the new world she had created with blood and steel, and 13 years of accumulated rage. The house around her bore witness to the night's work. 4 bodies lay where justice had found them. Marcus in his study, surrounded by books that could no longer justify human bondage. Benjamin in his chamber of torture, finally learning what true pain felt like. Theodore among his ledgers, his calculations corrected by death. Samuel in his chapel, his prayers answered by an axe-blade blessing. The Whitmore dynasty, 3 generations in the making, had been ended in a single night by a woman they had never bothered to see as human. As the light grew stronger, Rosa heard voices from the slave quarters, confusion and concern mixing with something that sounded almost like hope. The house slaves would be the first to discover what had happened, would be the ones to find their masters' bodies and understand that everything had changed forever. Rosa wondered what they would think, how they would react to the knowledge that one of their own had dared to raise her hand against white authority. The answer came sooner than expected. Maria, the head cook, appeared in the dining room doorway with a tray of breakfast preparations, her routine unchanged by the transformation of the world around her. She took in the scene with eyes that had witnessed too many horrors to be easily shocked. Rosa sitting calmly at the master's place, blood staining her dress, the strange silence that had replaced the usual sounds of morning activity. "Lord, have mercy," Maria whispered, setting down the tray with hands that trembled only slightly. "Child, what have you done? What needed doing?" Rosa replied, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. "What should have been done years ago?" Maria approached slowly, her experienced eyes taking in details that told the story of the night's events. The blood on Rosa's hands and clothes, the way she held herself like a woman who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, the terrible calm that surrounded her like armor forged from desperation and love. "They'll kill you for this," Maria said quietly. "You know that, don't you? White folks don't forgive slaves who raise hands against masters. They'll make an example of you that'll be talked about for generations." "I know," Rosa said, finally setting down the wine glass and looking directly at Maria. "I've always known, but they killed me already when they sold Isaiah. They killed the part of me that cared about tomorrow, that worried about consequences, that believed in survival over justice." Maria studied Rosa's face, seeing something there that made her nod slowly with understanding. She had lived long enough to recognize the look of a woman who had found her limit, who had discovered that some things mattered more than life itself. "The boy meant that much to you." "He meant everything," Rosa said simply. "He meant hope. He meant love. He meant the possibility that I was more than property, more than a thing to be bought and sold and used up. When they took him away, when they reduced him to numbers in Theodore's ledger, they took away the only good thing in my life." "And now?" Maria asked. "Now I've given them something to remember me by," Rosa said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile she had worn since Isaiah's sale. "Now every plantation owner in Georgia will know that slaves can fight back, that we're not just property to be managed, that we're human beings with hearts that break and souls that demand justice." By full morning, word of the massacre had spread throughout the plantation. House slaves discovered the bodies and spread the news to field hands, who passed it along to craftsmen and stable workers and everyone else whose life had been controlled by the Whitmore brothers' cruelty. The reactions were mixed. Fear predominated, because everyone understood what white retribution would look like, but underneath the terror ran currents of amazement and something that might have been pride. Rosa had done what none of them had dared to dream possible. She had struck back at their oppressors, had made the untouchable masters mortal, had proven that white skin didn't provide immunity from black justice. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. If Rosa could kill the Whitmore brothers, if a house slave could overthrow the natural order with nothing but an axe and accumulated rage, then what other impossibilities might become possible? But the celebration, such as it was, would be brief. By mid-morning, riders were approaching Magnolia Heights, summoned by a neighbor who had noticed the unusual quiet and come investigating. Sheriff William Buckley arrived with a posse of 6 men, all armed, all experienced in dealing with slave uprisings and the brutal suppression that such events required. Rosa watched their approach from the dining room windows, seeing dust clouds on the river road that announced the end of her brief reign as mistress of Magnolia Heights. She made no attempt to flee, showed no signs of panic or regret. Instead, she used the remaining time to prepare herself mentally for what was coming, to find the strength she would need to face death with dignity intact. When Sheriff Buckley entered the main house with his men, he found Rosa exactly where she had spent the morning, sitting at the head of the dining table, hands folded in her lap, expression calm as stone. The bodies of the Whitmore brothers had been discovered. The evidence of the night's violence was undeniable, and the perpetrator made no attempt to deny her guilt. "Rosa Washington," Sheriff Buckley said, using the surname that slaves weren't legally entitled to, but often adopted anyway. "You are under arrest for the murders of Marcus, Benjamin, Theodore, and Samuel Whitmore. Do you understand the charges against you?" "I understand," Rosa replied, rising gracefully from her chair. "I understand that I killed 4 men who treated human beings like livestock. I understand that I struck back at people who destroyed love for profit. I understand that I chose justice over survival." Sheriff Buckley studied her face, perhaps surprised by her composure, by the absence of the cowering fear he expected from slaves accused of capital crimes. "You confess to these murders?" "I confess to nothing," Rosa said, her voice steady and clear. "I don't confess to crimes. I take credit for justice. Those men were murderers of souls, destroyers of families, sellers of children. What I did to them is what they deserved." The sheriff's men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with Rosa's refusal to show appropriate remorse. Slaves were supposed to beg for mercy, to plead innocence, to grovel before white authority. Rosa's dignity in the face of certain death challenged their fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and natural order. They shackled her hands and feet with chains heavy enough to restrain a dangerous animal, the metal cutting into skin already raw from the night's work. Rosa bore the pain without complaint, understanding that the physical discomfort was insignificant compared to the spiritual freedom she had achieved. They could chain her body, but her soul had been liberated by the act of striking back at oppression. As they led her from the main house, Rosa looked back once at the scene of her triumph and her doom, the dining room where she had shared her last meal with ghosts, the hallways where she had carried justice from room to room, the windows that had watched her transformation from property to human being. She would never see this place again, but she had left her mark on it in ways that could never be erased. The slave quarters erupted in barely controlled chaos as Rosa was led past in chains. Some people wept openly. Others watched in stunned silence, and a few, the young ones mostly, who still remembered what hope felt like, looked at her with something approaching reverence. Rosa walked with her head high, her back straight, showing them how to face death with dignity intact. Word of the Magnolia Heights massacre spread across Georgia like wildfire, carried by travelers and traders and the Underground Railroad's network of secret communications. Within days, every plantation owner in the state knew that a house slave named Rosa had murdered 4 white men with an axe, that she had shown no remorse, that she had faced arrest and certain death with calm dignity. The psychological impact was exactly what Rosa had intended, proof that slaves were human beings capable of justice, revenge, and righteous anger. The trial, held in Savannah 3 weeks later, was a foregone conclusion. No jury of white men would ever acquit a slave of murdering her masters, regardless of the circumstances or justifications. The proceedings were more theater than justice, a public demonstration of white authority designed to restore the natural order that Rosa had so dramatically challenged. Rosa represented herself, speaking in her own defense with eloquence that surprised the courtroom and terrified the plantation owners in attendance. She told the story of her life in bondage, described the sale of Isaiah that had broken her heart, explained the systematic cruelty of the Whitmore brothers with calm precision. She made no excuses, offered no apologies, and requested no mercy. "I killed 4 men," she said in her closing statement, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "I killed them because they were killers themselves, killers of hope, killers of love, killers of the human spirit. They bought and sold people like livestock, separated families for profit, and treated children like merchandise. What I did to them, they had done to hundreds of others over the years. The only difference is that my victims were white." The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of murder in the first degree. Judge Harrison Caldwell sentenced Rosa to death by hanging, to be carried out on February 14, 1858, Valentine's Day, though Rosa doubted the irony was intentional. She would die on a day dedicated to love, executed for loving too deeply and fighting too fiercely for that love. In her cell in the Savannah jail, Rosa spent her final weeks writing. The jailers had provided paper and ink, perhaps thinking that she would use them to compose prayers for forgiveness or letters begging for clemency. Instead, Rosa wrote her story, the full account of her life in bondage, her love for Isaiah, and the night she had transformed from property into a force of nature. Her narrative was smuggled out of the jail by sympathetic guards and abolitionists, copied and distributed throughout the South and North. It became one of the most powerful testimonies of slave life ever recorded, a first-hand account of the human cost of bondage that moved readers to tears and rage in equal measure. Rosa's words carried more force than 1,000 political speeches, more impact than entire libraries of philosophical arguments. The night before her execution, Rosa received an unexpected visitor, Dr. Samuel Hopkins, a white minister from Boston who had traveled south to witness her final hours, sat across from her in the jail cell and asked if she feared death. "I feared life," Rosa replied. "I feared another day of pretending to be less than human, another morning of serving people who saw me as property, another night of missing Isaiah and knowing I'd never see him again. Death is just the end of fear." "Do you regret what you did?" Dr. Hopkins asked. "Do you wish you had chosen a different path?" Rosa considered the question seriously, looking back over the choices that had led her to this moment. "I regret that it was necessary," she said finally. "I regret that 4 human beings became so twisted by power that they had to be stopped with violence. But I don't regret stopping them. I don't regret showing the world that slaves are human beings who can fight back." "What do you want people to remember about you?" Dr. Hopkins asked, his pen poised over paper to record her final words. "I want them to remember that I loved," Rosa said, without hesitation. "I want them to remember that I was more than property, more than a thing to be bought and sold. I want them to remember that even in the darkest places, even under the worst circumstances, human beings can choose justice over survival. I want them to remember that love is stronger than law, that dignity is more valuable than life, that some things are worth dying for." February 14, 1858, dawned clear and cold in Savannah. A crowd of nearly 2,000 people gathered in the public square to witness Rosa's execution, their faces reflecting a mixture of morbid curiosity, racial hatred, and something that might have been uncertainty. The woman they had come to see die had challenged their fundamental assumptions about race and power, had proven that the natural order they believed in was neither natural nor permanent. Rosa walked to the gallows with the same dignity she had maintained throughout her trial and imprisonment. She wore a simple white dress provided by the jail, her hair braided with care, her bearing erect and proud. When asked if she had any last words, she looked out over the crowd of faces, white and black, slave and free, friend and enemy, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the square. "I die today because I dared to love," she said. "I die because I refused to accept that human beings could be bought and sold like property. I die because I chose justice over submission, dignity over survival. But I don't die alone. I die with Isaiah's love in my heart, with the knowledge that I struck back at evil, with the hope that others will remember my story and find courage in it." The executioner placed the noose around her neck, but Rosa continued speaking. To my people still in bondage, I say this: you are not property. You are human beings with souls and hearts and minds. You deserve freedom. You deserve love. You deserve justice. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you less than what God created you to be. The trapdoor opened, and Rosa Washington fell to her death on Valentine's Day 1858, becoming a martyr to love and justice and human dignity. But her story didn't end with her last breath. Her narrative, smuggled out of jail and distributed by abolitionists, became one of the most powerful weapons in the fight against slavery. Her words traveled farther than she ever had in life, reached more hearts than she could have touched in person, inspired more acts of resistance than any single rebellion. In slave quarters throughout the South, mothers told their children about Rosa's courage. In northern parlors, abolitionists read her story aloud to audiences who wept and raged and demanded action. In underground railroad stations, conductors used her example to inspire fugitives to keep running, to never give up hope, to remember that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The Magnolia Heights plantation was sold at auction 3 months after Rosa's execution, its fields divided among smaller farmers who couldn't afford the massive slave workforce the Whitmore brothers had maintained. The main house stood empty for years, its rooms haunted by memories of the Christmas Eve massacre, its halls echoing with the ghosts of 4 men who had learned too late that human beings cannot be owned forever. Rosa's grave in the Savannah potter's field became a pilgrimage site for slaves and free blacks who could manage the journey. They left flowers and small tokens, whispered prayers and promises, drew strength from the knowledge that one woman had stood up to the system that oppressed them all. The authorities tried to prevent these visits, but they couldn't stop the human need to honor those who die for love and justice. By 1860, Remember Rosa had become a rallying cry for abolitionists and a source of terror for slave owners. Her story was retold in 100 variations, her courage celebrated in songs and speeches and sermons. Some versions made her into a saint, others into a warrior, but all recognized her fundamental humanity, the love that had motivated her actions, the dignity she had maintained in death, the hope she had kindled in countless hearts. When the Civil War began in 1861, Union officers reported that enslaved people throughout the South knew Rosa's story, drew inspiration from her example, and saw her as a symbol of resistance to oppression. Contraband camps, settlements of escaped slaves who had fled to Union lines, often included shrines to Rosa's memory, simple memorials where people could remember the woman who had proven that slaves could fight back. In 1863, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, abolitionists claimed that Rosa's spirit was present at the signing, that her sacrifice had helped build the political will necessary to free 4 million human beings from bondage. Whether or not that was literally true, her story had certainly played a role in changing Northern attitudes about slavery, in making the abstract question of human bondage personal and immediate and urgent. After the war ended, Rosa's narrative was published as a book, Love and Justice: The True Story of Rosa Washington, which became required reading in schools throughout the North and eventually the South. Historians debated the details of her story, questioned some of the claims, argued about the accuracy of various accounts. But no one disputed the essential truth of what she had accomplished. She had proven that love could triumph over law, that dignity was stronger than death, that human beings would eventually choose freedom over safety. In 1958, exactly 100 years after Rosa's execution, the city of Savannah erected a memorial in her honor. The bronze statue showed her as she had appeared on the morning of December 25, 1857, standing tall and proud in the ruins of Magnolia Heights, holding the axe that had delivered justice, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone who had died for the crime of loving freedom more than life itself. The inscription on Rosa's memorial reads simply, "She chose love over law, justice over survival, dignity over death. In her courage, we find our own. In her sacrifice, we discover our strength. In her memory, we promise never to forget that human beings cannot be owned, that love cannot be sold, that justice delayed is not justice denied forever." Today, Rosa Washington's story continues to inspire people fighting against oppression around the world. Her narrative has been translated into dozens of languages, adapted for stage and screen, taught in universities and high schools as an example of how individuals can change history through acts of moral courage. She has become more than a woman, more than a slave, more than a victim or a hero. She has become a symbol of the indomitable human spirit, proof that even in the darkest circumstances, people can choose love and justice and dignity over fear and submission and death. If this story has moved you, if Rosa's courage has inspired you, then her sacrifice was not in vain. Subscribe to ensure you never miss stories of those who chose love over law, justice over safety, truth over comfort. Share this narrative with others who need to remember that human beings are not property, that love cannot be legislated away, that justice will always find a way to be heard, even if it speaks with the voice of an axe in the hands of a woman who refused to accept that some people were born to serve and others to rule. Rosa Washington died on Valentine's Day 1858, but her love lives on in every heart that refuses to accept injustice, every voice that speaks truth to power, every hand that reaches out to help the oppressed find freedom. She proved that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, especially when guided by people willing to sacrifice everything for love.